United States Attorney James Santelle, I thank you for your time this afternoon.
TJ, I'm delighted to be with you today.
And before we get started, I know you were appointed by President Barack Obama. Tell us what the United States Attorney does on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. I was appointed 3 years ago by the President. It is a position of tremendous authority and responsibility. I am the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the Eastern District of Wisconsin. That's a mouthful. It basically means I'm responsible ultimately for the enforcement of all federal criminal and civil law. And it is a very broad responsibility. It includes violent crime enforcement. It involves white-collar healthcare fraud, economic fraud, kidnapping, bank robbery, all kinds of violent crimes and non-violent financial crimes, all kinds of things in the criminal docket. And then we also have a civil docket. We enforce the environmental laws, civil rights laws, tax laws, all kinds of things that are important to the safety and security of the community.
And today we're honing in on sex trafficking in particular. Now, when one thinks of sex trafficking, I would think that the average person would say that goes on in another country, overseas somewhere. Let's talk about here in the United States and here locally in our state and the city of Milwaukee. How big of a problem is sex trafficking today?
TJ, you hit it right on the head. People think that this is something that goes on overseas in Europe or even in Africa or in Asia. It is right here in America, in the United States, and right here in Wisconsin as well. And as a matter of fact, Wisconsin, as you well know, is one of the hubs, regrettably and unfortunately, for sex trafficking, and we can talk about the reasons for that. Sex trafficking is a problem of tremendous dimension today. It is growing, and the public needs to know through these mechanisms and others about the ways in which people, typically young women, but not exclusively young women and sometimes young boys, are victimized by people who quite literally prey upon them, get them involved in the sex business, sell their bodies to people who would buy their bodies, quite literally, and economically the people who are responsible for this make money off of these victimized people.
And the victims, they range from children all the way to adults?
They do, absolutely. We see often very many minors, young women and sometimes young boys who are below the age of 18, who are lured sometimes into large metropolitan areas by the promise of good jobs, sometimes glamorous jobs, economic enhancement. But we also see young adults who are also lured for those same purposes. Invariably, the people who bring them to Milwaukee or Chicago or Los Angeles or New York are enticing them to come to these places with false promises. And invariably, what happens is those promises are dashed, and they're here in circumstances that are very, very unfortunate.
And when you say lured, because one couldn't even imagine how could one find themselves in a situation where they are being trafficked. So when you say lured with false promises, maybe they're promised good jobs and good financial reward for doing such things?
Precisely. Often these are people, young people, who are preyed upon because of their family circumstances. They may, in some instances, be runaways. They may not have a family connection. And so they see this person who offers them, as you said, the enticement of a great job in a big city with economic stability, with social stability, and they see that as a way to get out of a future. There are also circumstances where people, again, young women, who are not apart from their families, who are not economically distressed, who are also lured just again by the promise of economic growth and potential, by a glamorous job, by something that is attracted to them, even if their home situation, their local situation is not problematic. And that's the great horrific nature of this crime, which is legitimate, good people brought into it by virtue of these false promises and terrible promises made to them to bring them into the cities, and they are then trafficked as a result of that kind of work.
I can somewhat understand how that could happen to an adult, but a child. So when you talk about luring a child into a situation with false promises, how do children get wrapped up in sex trafficking?
It is because, TJ, exactly what was implicit in your question, because they are our most vulnerable victims. They're not sophisticated. They do not understand that this person, typically a male, who is the trafficker himself, that person is not their friend. They are purported to be their friend, but just like all children who are promised, whether it's candy or even a little older children, a car or clothes, those kinds of things, you tend to believe that person who's giving you good things and making you good promises is your friend, is your ally, is your associate. And in fact, it's a part of a scheme. It's fraud. And that's why children are especially vulnerable when someone comes to them and says, come to Milwaukee. I will make your life better. I'll put you in a good house. I'll get you a good job. I'll have you in front of a modeling camera. I will give you good friends, a place to live, a place to sleep, good food and good friends, and it's all a lie.
Would you say these children come from broken homes, or maybe they are homeless or don't have parents?
They often do. They often do. Many times they're running away from situations that are horrific in and of themselves. There may be some domestic violence, some abuse, and again, they're looking for something better. And so this person or these people come along and say, I can offer that to you. I can make your life better. And naturally, it's human nature to be attracted to that, especially if you're 14 or 15 or 16 years old and do not have the sophisticated social skills that you and I might have to say, wait a minute, this sounds too good to be true. But once again, as you indicated, there are young adults and even young, more adult adults who have become involved in this just because also they're prey to these kinds of false promises.
What kind of effect does the economy have on sex trafficking? I would assume that there are millions, maybe even billions of dollars in such an industry, but when you think of joblessness, especially here in our city of Milwaukee and the economy today, what kind of impact does that have on sex trafficking?
It has two very significant components when we talk about the economic impact and the economic reality of sex trafficking. One is the thing you and I just chatted about, which is people who don't have jobs, who don't have economic stability, see this as a way of getting it. And that's why they're lured in, that's why they're attracted to the possibility of an economic base and a foundation that can keep them secure. That's a part of it. And then there is the trafficking itself, which is selling typically these young women, sometimes young boys, whether it's on the internet, through other mechanisms, and the traffickers themselves make huge amounts of money. And they make it, again, on the backs and on the good lives of these young victims who are horrifically treated. And that is economic as well. It is all money, obviously, going to the traffickers themselves. Plainly, this is not a legitimate business at all, so we hardly even need to talk about the tax-related consequences, but the economics of this are becoming huge, and it is a multi-million-dollar business nationwide.
So it's interesting, you said those that do the trafficking or the traffickers, they make lots of money. What about the victims in the situation?
The victims almost invariably make nothing, and that's the other part of the tragedy. We indicted a case just recently in which the trafficker himself not only lured young women to this area and recruited them for his sex trafficking business, but provided them with nothing, and in fact turned them into heroin addicts. The ultimate just degradation of the human being and the human psyche and the human spirit. They not only do not make any money, but they're often completely turned into dependent individuals on the people who are trafficking. So they very seldom make money themselves. They may be taken care of in the sense that they're provided with some food, certainly transportation to the places where the sex trafficking takes place. They're provided with some housing, but it is certainly not the kind of economic stability and life stability that they were promised at the outset. They do not profit from it. The traffickers themselves profit from it hugely.
A moment ago, you mentioned Milwaukee being a hub. What does that mean?
It means that Milwaukee, for a number of reasons which we can also chat about, is a place where this happens with great frequency. I am told reliably by some of my good law enforcement colleagues who investigate these cases tremendously well and follow up on them and present these cases to us for prosecution, that Wisconsin is among the top 10 or 15 states in the country where this is going on today. And Milwaukee, plainly, the largest metropolitan area in the state, is at the top of that list. And what it means is that we have people who are both here and people coming into Milwaukee who prey upon our young girls and sometimes our young boys as well, sometimes bringing them from Chicago, other cities throughout the state of Wisconsin, and they provide, again, these false promises as a premise, as a predicate to get them involved in this sex trafficking. The trafficking itself is literally putting these young men and women out for sale for the sex that they can offer. And then we have the businessmen and others who will take advantage of that, pay money to the traffickers here in Milwaukee and other places, and that's where the economic benefit comes to those traffickers. But Wisconsin is a hub for this, and Milwaukee is certainly at the top of that list.
Let's look at sex trafficking from an ethnic perspective. Are there certain groups that are more likely to be traffickers or even victims?
Right. It's very interesting. The statistics indicate that up to this point, any member of any racial group can in fact be a victim of this. There are certainly great numbers of African American young women who are victimized by this, but that's not to say that there are also not white young girls who are being victimized by this, and young women, adults who are being victimized. We have Latino young women and young men who likewise are victimized. And although there are numbers and statistics being maintained on this, the reality is that this is regrettably a crime that visits equally upon virtually all ethnic groups, even Asians. And so it is a problem that kind of crosses all ethnic borders. And while we see some spikes here and there, I tend to think of this as a crime and a horrific kind of activity that visits equally upon all racial groups.
When it comes to just the area, we mentioned Wisconsin and Milwaukee. Are there certain areas, even in the city or various cities in the state, that sex trafficking is more prominent?
Sure. And again, it tends to focus, as you just indicated, upon the large metropolitan areas. Why? Number one, that's where the population is. And because of a couple things we also hinted at already, it tends to gravitate toward those large population areas. When sporting events happen, large events where people, again, typically men, come to a city, perhaps spending a weekend away from their families, that is a prime audience for the sex trafficking activity to take place. Likewise, much of the sex trafficking is offered through the internet, and that has been much publicized, the ways in which, again, the young men and women typically are promoted. This is an individual who you can literally purchase tonight, tomorrow night, by getting in touch with this particular person, and she will provide you with the sex favors and the sexual activities that are part of the negotiated scheme then. So it tends to gravitate to those areas where there are large populations, and because of the internet and because of the possibility of doing this, where there are large sporting events, even large concerts, things where people tend to come to places to congregate, the large population centers tend to be the large focus of this activity.
Let's look at sex trafficking versus prostitution. Are they one of the same?
I like to think that prostitution, which this is ultimately at its core, is nonetheless a small component of it. We indicated already in our conversation that sex trafficking is a business. It's a $1 million business nationwide. It's no longer the case. When I was growing up, for example, you think about 26th in Wisconsin as being a place where prostitution would take place, and there may be individuals who are driving around and soliciting sex on the street. Certainly the notion of selling a human body, which is horrific, to another individual for sex, that concept of prostitution, that is horrific and that is terrible. But this is so much more than that. This is organized prostitution. These are people who have identified many, many young girls and young women who are part of a larger group. They are promoted, as I said, on the internet through other mechanisms. The information is provided to large numbers of people in these large metropolitan areas, and they are sophisticated, and they are moving people around. The traffickers, that is, are moving their victims around in the city, outside of the city. We prosecuted a case not too long ago where the perpetrator, the trafficker, would quite literally take the young girls and the young women to Chicago for a Saturday night and would transport them down there in a bus and sell them in Chicago, and then return them the following day or days to Milwaukee. So it is an interstate issue, it is a large business, and prostitution, while that's the concept at the core, it is much more than that and much more horrific.
Do the victims generally do this 24 hours a day, or do they try to live a normal life during the day and then they do this at night, or how does that work?
It varies, of course, depending upon where they are and what their relationship is with their trafficker. But the reality is, once they are involved in this activity, 24 hours a day, TJ, they're committed to that trafficker. And we work with so many victims in our office and try to provide them with support, good legitimate housing and good jobs, those kinds of things. Almost to a person, they say that my trafficker is my lifeboat. This is the person who has given me the opportunity to have not a decent job, but certainly food and housing and those kinds of things we talked about before. And while it's difficult to say that they'll do that 24 hours a day, the reality is the 24-hour-a-day connection is always there. And they can be called upon by their trafficker at any moment to be a part of the trip to Chicago, to stay here in Milwaukee, to respond to a large population that's at a sporting event, at a concert, at some other large event. So the reality is they're never away from it.
You seem like you've probably tried many cases.
Our office has, yes. I have not actually taken to trial myself any of these cases, and the good news about this, as we talk about the horror of this trafficking kind of activity, is that our cases are so well investigated, they very seldom actually go to trial. The case that I talked about a little while ago involved a fellow named Sean Patrick, who received a 30-year sentence from Judge Randa, who looked at the nature of this horrific abuse upon many, many women and said this is someone who should go to jail for a very long period of time. The reason that case went to trial, did not go to trial, is because our evidence was so strong. The victims did in the end come forward with a lot of support and assistance and testify about what Patrick did to them. And because of that, we seldom take these cases to trial, although we are always ready to do so, and we don't indict these cases until we're ready to prove those cases beyond a reasonable doubt.
And since we're there talking about cases, let's talk about penalties.
Yes.
Because I'm assuming that it's illegal on both sides. So the trafficker as well as the victim. Tell us about the penalties.
Yes, excellent question. There are some very significant penalties based upon a law that was passed by the Congress in 2000, about 13 years ago. And today, for example, an individual we just indicted a couple of weeks ago is facing a penalty of anywhere from 15 years in jail to life imprisonment for this kind of activity. In addition, a $250,000 monetary penalty, which frankly pales in comparison to the notion of putting that person away for his horrific activity. And that's for a singular count. That's for a conspiracy and also for counts inside that kind of activity. There's also a 10-year penalty for crossing state lines to engage in this kind of activity as well, and we also charge that. So these are not misdemeanors. These are serious felonies, and the defendants, the traffickers, as I say, in federal court and also in state court are getting some very serious penalties. The Sean Patrick conviction and the sentencing of a little over a year ago, 30 years in jail, that is significant, and that's representative of the kinds of things that are going on. As to the victims themselves, that's a great challenge because, as you indicated, technically they're also involved in the conspiracy to engage in trafficking.
And they've been forced many times.
They've been forced, and that's the point. It is the view of the Department of Justice, and my view as well, certainly the view of my colleague prosecutors and our victim witness support group, that these truly are victims. While they are technically a part of a scheme and a conspiracy to violate the law, the reality is that they are victims of horrific conduct by others visited upon them. And so with very rare exceptions, we typically do not prosecute them. We instead, what the response of the Department of Justice is to get them away from that trafficker, to get them out of that lifestyle, to find, as we possibly can through the victim witness program and support for women and other mechanisms of the Department of Justice and in my office, to find them good housing away from that trafficking lifestyle, hopefully to hook them up with a good job, to reunite them with family often broken, to get them into a situation where they can move forward with their lives. And we typically do not add to that mix a prosecution which would undermine those good things and to get them back on the road toward a good and healthy life.
Over the course of time, has sex trafficking here in our state become a bigger problem, or has the problem become, gotten smaller?
It's a terrific question. I've been a prosecutor for about 25, closing in on 30 years now, including my time as the U.S. Attorney. I don't recall when I began this job a quarter of a century or so ago that this was an issue. This was simply not on the radar. As I said, the congressional law that permits us to prosecute was passed in 2000, just 13 years ago, and we're using it more and more. My strong sense, and I know it's the sense of the law enforcement community out there, the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Milwaukee Police Department, other police departments, the Department of Division of Criminal Investigation of the State Department of Justice, all of us work together. All of those people will tell you that this problem is increasing. Okay. It is not plateauing, and it certainly has increased over the period of the last 10, 15, 20 years. And that's the reason why it has been and remains a top priority of my office and of other offices around the country as we attack this horrific problem.
So with all that being said, what is the government, if anything, doing to combat this problem?
The first thing is we are devoting considerable prosecutorial resources to just this. One of the things I'm very proud of inside our office is we put together a human trafficking task force. It is led by my wonderful executive assistant, Tracy Johnson, and she has brought together people around the table who are, again, investigators, they're support service specialists, they're social service providers, and they're also in all those different venues, if you will, the state, the federal, the local, and frankly, sometimes even the tribal law enforcement authorities for our Indian reservations who are attacking this problem. What do? We sit around and we talk about trends so that we can be above the curve, if you will, and trying to figure out what's happening. But we also talk about specific case prosecutions so that we can ensure that our limited resources are used in the very best way possible. So you may get a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation working with an officer of the Milwaukee Police Department, a detective of the Milwaukee Police Department. You may get a special agent of Homeland Security working with a deputy sheriff in a particular area on a particular case. And we do all that to coordinate very effectively the investigation of these cases. We then pursue a very effective prosecution strategy. I talk to my colleague John Chisholm all the time about these cases, and we decide where cases are best prosecuted. He also is very much committed to this work in Milwaukee, as are the other DAs around the state of Wisconsin. So it's investigation, it's prosecution, and it's also what we already discussed, which is victim support. We ensure that not only do we prosecute and achieve these very effective sentences to make certain that people understand that if you engage in this activity in Wisconsin, you will go to jail for a long period of time, but we also work with the victims. We don't simply call them to trial. We don't simply ask them to testify before a grand jury and then leave them alone. It's also a part of our fundamental function to make sure, as I said before, that we are providing them with an avenue, a mechanism for a much better life.
Attorney Santelle or Jim, I thank you for your time today.
TJ, it's my great pleasure, and I so much applaud you for addressing and bringing to the attention of our community this horrific problem, and I applaud your efforts in this area as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.